Thank you. So, what were my questions to you? While we're talking about all these things, I remember reading a comment by Senator Mitchell when the Anglo-Irish Accord was signed. And he said that he paid compliments to the British bureaucracy and the Irish bureaucracy, how these guys are able to work their way through very difficult, complex issues. I'm just wondering, this issue of backstop, how is it, it's become a bone stuck in the throat for the whole process. How is it that in your system, the Irish system, and the EU system, no alarm bells ringing as to how this issue is going to be handled, how it will be finished in terms, how it must be finished in terms of larger objective, which I think. Now, the other side of this, of course, is that the Anglo-Irish Accord gets ruptured, it's ripped up. I wonder what the legal implications of that are. But certainly one implication clearly is that there is a group of people in Northern Ireland who actually are given to ways of violence. And one explosion already has taken place. So we don't know how that process, what kind of force are being unleashed, both in Northern Ireland and a consequence of that in the British Isles, in Ireland, and its implications in terms of the UK-US relationship, the FTA and so on and so forth. So, what I'm trying to say is that how is it that something like that wasn't seen? And it became a kind of trying to push it somehow or the other, try to take advantage of the fog and the confusion of politicking and alliances and whatever were taking place, these tactical alliances. So that's one issue. And I'm wondering as to how that is to be seen in terms, and it has large implications for us. I mean, if there is resurgence of violence, of terrorism, anything like that there's wider consequences. So my point actually is that how is it that this is not being talked about, even the British discourse today, as to what the implications of that are? And my second question really is, after Supreme Court judgment, now I guess the Parliament and the House of Commons would be convened quite early, and the entire tactic or the strategy of Boris Johnson, I think it just goes for a toss. And I wonder what the effect of it will be when it's convened, because there's more time for the House of Commons to deliberate and to cogitate or to make things more difficult. As it is, he has no majority in the House of Commons. So I'm just wondering how it's all going to play out and how that scenario is going to be woven into the 31st October deadline that one's talking about. Of course, one other side of that is that if President Macron actually has said that why should we keep giving extension to Britain? If they can't make up their mind, it's their business. So maybe that could be some way out for the present British Prime Minister. But the fact of the matter is that you have much more confusion now is taking place. Thank you.
Well, I think...
Should we take just one or two more questions?
Oh, okay.
In the back, ma'am. Yeah.
So this whole discussion right now, we're focusing on...
If you could just identify yourself. Sorry, Ambassador.
I'm Yogesh Kumar.
Ambassador Yogesh Kumar.
I'm Bidisha Banerjee. So the focus right now is on Brexit from the British point of view. There is not much discourse what the European Union feels if UK were to move out. I mean, we talk about Macron or other European countries who are opposing or saying, move out, get it over with. But what price will EU pay if Britain were to go out, not only politically but economically? I mean, Britain cannot be a third pole. So if EU is viewed as another pole, multipolar world, how will it weaken the EU? And is the EU going to do anything in this to not just stop Britain from moving out, but also make sure that the other players in the EU don't start going in the same route?
And then third question here.
This is Parminder Singh from Wipro, and we've got significant investments in the UK last now 25 years. One big anxiety that our customers, especially given that financial sector is much more technology now, manufacturing is much more technology now, is what will be the impact of skills availability of skills in the UK, are we looking at a disruption which is going to last for a couple of years? Your, I think, remarks on that.
Okay. Well, in relation to the last three questions, your question, yours, Madam at the back, and your second one, I think I can give some very quick and very definitive answers. We then come to the first question that you asked, which is much more complicated. Availability of skills, I think I can confidently predict there will be no noticeable effect at all. One of the ironies of the whole Brexit debate is that it seems to me absolutely clear that the UK economy requires broadly the same skill base that it has at the moment. It will have increasing needs for skill importation, including IT and others, and therefore, actually, regardless of whether we're in the EU, out of the EU, or in any other position, actually, successive UK governments will have to legislate, maybe very unpopular, but nevertheless, they will have to legislate to ensure that we continue to have the same flow as we've had before. End of. That's a message which would be devastating if it was understood in large parts of the UK, but as a matter of fact, I think it's the truth. So far as the EU feelings on Brexit are concerned, I mean, here we're talking about EU governments, so I have no idea what Madame Pompier in the middle of Dijon feels about it, but if you're asking what is the collective view of current EU governments, opposition parties in the EU, the European Commission and so on, I think the answer is it's not a very important subject. They're much more concerned about some other things. The UK leaving is a bit of a bore, but it's not very much more. If we leave without a deal, it's a bit more of a bore, but it's still not very much of anything. It's only 9% of EU exports, about 7.5 percentage points of which, 3/4 or more, are pretty price inelastic, so it doesn't actually matter very much. And their main concern is to ensure, first of all, that this whole ghastly saga is over so they can get on and think about other things, and secondly, to make sure that it does not have what you were describing at the end, a sort of domino effect. So, in a sense, the nastier it is for the UK, the better, because there's a more deterrent effect on anyone else trying the same thing. So I think the whole thesis, which has been a predominant feature of our debate in the UK, that somehow we matter a lot to the EU, is false. I think it's very straightforward. So far as the Supreme Court judgment is concerned, actually, although I think it will have huge, as the Ambassador was saying, huge long-term ricochet consequences for the development of the unwritten and probably non-existent constitution of the UK, in terms of the Brexit outcome, it probably is totally insignificant because we were going to be assembling anyway in Parliament on the 14th of October.
But it might be early now, no?
Yes, but without giving you away any details, I can assure you that my colleagues and I across the parties are fully prepared to do everything we need to do between now and the 31st of October from the 14th anyway, so if we can do it a bit earlier, we'll do it a bit earlier, but who cares? We have already achieved the extension that we need to achieve. We will lock that in. I don't think it makes any difference, really. It would have made a difference if they had been able to prorogue in a way that had prevented us passing the law we passed, but actually it facilitated our passing the law by creating a short time scale and enabling us to do it quickly. So I don't think that...
So he stays where he goes, the Prime Minister?
Sorry?
Does he stay where he goes? He's in the minority now.
I think the Prime Minister will be there for the time being. He's not in the minority, really, because if there was a confidence vote for tomorrow, he'd win it.
I see.
I mean, I would vote for him in place of Mr. Corbyn. So I don't think he's got a problem about remaining in post. His problem is about achieving what he was at least seeking to achieve, which was leaving without a deal. That, I think, we have blocked. Now, come to the difficult question, which is the backstop and its implications. I'm sure we shouldn't spend the next 20 minutes having a detailed conversation about all the aspects of the backstop. But I personally believe that this is not a failure of the negotiating teams and the bureaucracies on either side. Or if you include the Irish as a third party, three sides. Actually, I know this may sound strange, but actually I think the backstop is quite a good arrangement. And actually, while we're at it, I think a Northern Ireland only version of the backstop would be a perfectly workable arrangement too. The problem lay in the fact that for party political reasons, the Labour Party wasn't willing to vote for it. And for reasons of conviction, though in my view entirely misplaced, a large number of my colleagues in the European Research Group faction of the Conservative Party were not willing to vote for it. and therefore it couldn't get a majority in the House of Parliament. That was the problem. I don't think as a negotiated text it caused a problem. And in fact, some variant of it is, I think, literally the only way you could possibly hope to achieve an orderly withdrawal agreement in advance of having negotiated the future trading relationship. Because the fundamental, comes back to the question of the EU's view of all this, the fundamental concern of the Commission and of most of the Member States was to preserve the integrity of the single market. They, I think, understandably regard the single market as the most notable achievement of the EU to date. And it depends on having a policed external border. Clearly, you cannot have a completely tariff and customs-free zone, which does operate as a single economy. It genuinely does operate that way in traded goods, if you don't police the external borders. You're simply, at that stage, opening yourself to endless asymmetries between you and other WTO partners. So the big question was, how do you stop leakage? And you can only stop leakage at a border. And that means you either have to stop it at the Irish Sea, to the east of Ireland, or at the north-south border between the north and the south of Ireland. There's no other place you can do it. And what the backstop does is simply say, until and unless we have negotiated a final and workable long-term free trading relationship, which controls the flow of goods one way and the other, there will be the same set of rules that there are at the moment, either covering Northern Ireland only or covering Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole, the rest of GB. So I think actually the backstop was not a mistake or a piece of dictation by the EU to the UK. It was the only way that serious diplomats thinking about a serious problem could resolve the ambition of the UK to leave and the requirement of the EU to maintain the single market integrity. And therefore, actually, what Boris is now discovering is the same thing that Mrs. May discovered over quite a long period, which is you've got this triangle of forces. You've got the EU wanting to preserve its integrity. You've got the Irish government not wanting to recreate a border control at the north-south border because of the long history and people being shot there and all the bloodshed you referred to and so on. And you've got a certain number of my colleagues in Parliament who, for one reason or another, are not willing to vote for a solution to that. And that is a triangle of forces extremely difficult to resolve. That's why we're in the crisis we're in.
Ambassador Mathai, you comments or views?
I think that's absolutely well put. It's a triangle of forces. It's not that they didn't anticipate some of these problems, but there was no other formula that could meet the requirements of at least two out of these three. So I think that they did the best they could. But it brings up larger questions also. One is the distinct possibility that if you have a border, you are reopening the very, very drastic situation 69 to 98. There's another formula, which is that the Irish economy is actually still quite heavily tilted towards the UK rather than the rest of the EU. I don't know the percentages exactly, but it's not quite as diffuse a relationship with the UK as in other EU countries. So this lack of a border could mean two things. One, that Northern Ireland over time, if this backstop gets extended, ultimately becomes part of the Republic of Ireland as an economic unit, and how that will match with being part of a sovereign UK is a problem which only the European Research Group can answer. But that's one. But there is another possibility, that if the EU were not as successful in maintaining its current integrity, that the Republic of Ireland's economy may in fact gravitate more towards the UK. But that's remote at this point. I think what you have declared as a inability of negotiators to work out is because of one out of these three in the triangle not being willing to compromise. That's the way I see it. But they'll have to do it. But in response to that question which was asked from there, I would add one thing, that the EU, I don't quite share Oliver's I think they were a little more worried about the British leaving and its domino effect than they have let on. Because if you see what the state of play in Italy's politics, for example, it opens up the question quite seriously as to whether this may not be related to Britain, but it may be right at the core, one of the original 6 raising questions about have we actually benefited from being part of the euro and so on, which are very serious questions in Italy. So there is a very, very serious problem there. And as far as the EU's global influence is concerned, I think in trading terms, in financial terms, it will certainly remain as strong a global player as it was. There are 2 areas where I think it might diminish without Britain. One is in defense, because now it is only France which has truly got a global military presence, and certainly in the field of intelligence, this is something they are going to lose out on. But there was no European integration on that, but there was certainly intelligence sharing.
Well, and the paradox in many ways is that exactly at this moment where you could have the opportunity to work on that in Europe, and PESCO is happening, for example, on defense, and there's a slow militarization of the EU, as I mentioned, and securitization of the EU. Very slow, but it's happening. It's exactly at this point that your major asset is opting out.
One of
in
the
many
2,
ways,
yeah.
they're the major one. You're right. In many ways, the UK
2,
is
France and UK.
France comes a second, I'd say, but the UK has been the major one. And on the other hand, sir, in many ways, to what extent does it complicate the relation? Does it uncomplicate the relationship? You know, you could argue that in many ways the UK has never been deeply involved in the EU integration process. It's always been a reluctant, skeptical actor from the beginning, and therefore this, in many ways, opens up new possibilities. And so, just 2 last questions for you, for 1 minute each, sir.
Just a follow.
Yeah,
just
please.
a follow. So, in terms of, as you described, the whole negotiations on backstop,
Sir, please.
what was the problem actually? I mean, Theresa May wasn't able to do proper consultations with the different groups in her party and outside the party, so that she could build a political consensus in the House of Commons for her agreement to be passed.
Can I ask a very generic question?
Please.
No, I'm General Sani. I just wanted to ask you an issue that keeps coming to my mind. You mentioned about it that you haven't. I mean, we know how the Constitution, it's more of conventions. With the changing demographic profile and what's happened in the last about few years, is there time for the UK to really put down a constitution and written order? Because I think, there's a changing demographic pattern. People's value systems are changing. People's understanding of issues is colored by the own vision where they come from. And that actually will have a great impact. I mean, we've seen some incidents that have happened where this has been an issue. So, I mean, it's a very generic question. If you'd like to answer that, I'd be delighted to hear it.
Yes. Well, let me just quickly say, for the last quarter of a century, I have been arguing for a written constitution for the UK. A quarter of a century ago, as far as I know, I was the only Conservative member of Parliament who took this view, and one of very few members of Parliament of any persuasion. It is now becoming, if not a majority view, quite a large number of people. And the events of the last few months have been indicating the massive problems of not having a constitution in our country. We wrote quite a good constitution for Germany in the basic law. We exported people who wrote quite a good constitution for the United States. We've been quite good at inventing other people's constitutions, but we've been very bad at inventing a constitution for ourselves.
We're willing to help.
Sorry?
We are willing to help.
Well, we may need some help from you. You have quite a good constitution. We're quite good at enforcing the constitution we don't have, but we're not very good at having one. Maybe you have the opposite problem to some extent.
The longest one in the world.
But no, look, I think we have an issue we're going to have to address. Not quickly, because you don't write constitutions if you're sensible in 5 minutes, but over time. Your question about how it was that the previous Prime Minister failed to get a majority composed of her own members of Parliament in favour of compromise is going to be one of the things that people are going to write a lot of books about. And I think it's the kind of history that Louis Namier favoured. You'd have to go through the precise relationships between her and various specific individuals and what went wrong. And it's a very interesting question, but it's a great failure of statesmanship, for sure. I think had it been done very quickly, it could have been done much more easily. Part of it was about a long delay and people getting into entrenched positions. But there are many other features of the scene, and they make a very interesting book. I just want to say quickly this thing to make an observation about the security and intelligence sharing, because I think defence and intelligence sharing is a very important issue. I sat for 6 years on the National Security Council. In the entire time, we never had a discussion about UK, EU intelligence sharing or defence. We had many discussions about bilateral relationships with France, which are intensely important. NATO, Five Eyes.
Five Eyes.
Intelligence sharing with the United States in particular, which is a crux of the relationship, and indeed, while we're at it, defence relationships, for example, with India. So the European defence arrangements were enormously important to us, but they were conducted on a bilateral basis with major European powers and not with the EU, and I think will continue to be so. And so far as the intelligence sharing is concerned, which is more important, I think, even than the defence relationship, I agree with the Ambassador entirely about that, actually, part of the point of having an orderly withdrawal is it's perfectly possible to replicate the intelligence sharing arrangements as long as you do so in a spirit of compromise, amity, and so on. What causes the problem is not leaving the EU or being part of the EU. What causes the problem is if there's antagonism and friction, and then it takes time to sort these things out. In the long run, the interest both of the UK and of EU member states in having appropriate intelligence sharing is so great that I think that those relationships will be knitted back together again. But the question is whether there's a disruption for a period before they get knitted back together again.
So just to finish off, sir, to you a question about the future. Same to you, sir. Let me quote Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He says, as we come out of the EU, we are going up a gear. We are going to take advantage of all the freedoms that Brexit can give, whether that is new tax allowance for investment or speeding up public procurement contracts. So you've served in London. If this happens, once it happens, where do you see the greatest opportunities for the UK and India to work together in certain sectors, in specific sectors, in a post-Brexit phase?
I think definitely one area is going to be in the whole area of finance. The City of London and more generally British financial institutions as a vehicle both for raising funds for India's development. I read somewhere today that the masala bonds are actually raising more rupees outside India than some of our bigger funds are raising within the country. That is one. The second is in technology and education, science, technology. This is something on which both our governments have bilaterally and without any hype managed to keep alive despite everything that's happening in Britain, and that's a very, very important area. The third is an area where we haven't, I think, concentrated enough effort, but I hope if Brexit forces a change of view among some of the big companies, is in defence manufacturing. This is an area in which Britain is still very strong, and don't get the wrong impressions that they are bit players there. They are still very strong in this, and they, I think, would benefit from building kind of relationships with India, which is going to need a whole lot more defence and defence industry on its own soil before long. I put these three as the big ones. Fourth, of course, generally the global discourse keeping democracy alive. Because don't forget, when we talk about these anti-immigration forces and anti-sovereign forces and so on, these are realities which we have to accommodate. But one needs to understand that the opposite side is not motivated only by lack of jobs. There are issues of religion, there are issues of race,
political culture,
which, at least as democratic societies, certainly one of the things we need between India and Britain is far more think tank exchanges and discourses, and some of this should feed into the public domain.
Good. Sir, last word to you, also slightly prospective, if you allow. How do you see, by order of priority, the most important factors tying post-Brexit UK to the EU? On what areas, I assume trade and the basic economic relations, but what other areas could the UK and EU work together and show up in the rest of the world as a joint vision for this emerging, uncertain, multipolar order?
Well, I mean, I think we've explored many of them. Clearly, the trading relationship and the investment relationship and the financial relationship is the centerpiece. That will, one way or another, have to continue and be opened up and strengthened. Clearly, the intelligence sharing and the defence cooperation are of great importance. While we're at it, there's a large amount of stuff which goes on that nobody really notices, but which matters a lot, to do, for example, with criminal intelligence and control of anti-terrorism and so on. There's a whole series of security-related issues that are sort of domestic security issues that have to be handled and are very important. I think the big question over the next 20 or 30 years is, whatever the relationship is of the UK to the EU, is the ability or inability of the UK and the other major European powers, in whatever form they emerge from all of this, to have a cohesive view of the role of Europe in the relationship between the great moving parts of the world, US, China, India, the rest of Asia, the other BRICS, so on. At the moment, I think it would be fair to say that Europe does not have a foreign policy and never has had a foreign policy. Oh, sorry, when I say never has had, I mean never since the war has had a foreign policy. There was a moment when, for example, Germany had a foreign policy which was called Ostpolitik. That was a real thing. There was a moment when Mrs. Thatcher had a foreign policy which was with Reagan to end the Cold War by defeating the Soviet Union. But if you ask at the moment, what is the strategic 30, 40-year horizon foreign policy of the UK, of France, of Germany, of the EU as a whole, you can't give an answer. That is a major problem for the world, because this is a quarter of the world's GDP we're talking about, and it has to play a role. And it's either going to be a constructive or a non-constructive role, and unless it knows what role it's playing, it's very likely to slip by mistake into a non-constructive role. So that's the really important issue, and that's got to be forged, I think, by the EU countries and the UK, regardless of the relationship of the UK to the EU as an institution, because, as a matter of fact, their interests are almost identical in that respect.
And geography.
Interest and geography mean that actually...
and way of life, if I may bring it.
But yes, that too, actually. But I mean, the truth is, in terms of way of life, there's a great deal of similarities we were observing in the session this morning between European countries, India, Japan, so on, and indeed the US. In terms of political culture, there's quite a long distance between the US and Europe. In terms of economic interest, there's an almost identity of interest between the EU countries and the UK on the one side and the US on the other than particular firms that they may want to promote. But I mean, broadly, it's been operating as one kind of market, indeed with Canada and Australia and so on as well. And the whole interest in the fostering of an open, free trading world, it has been an identity of interest. So the question is, will Europe now find a way of exerting its voice in order to keep the peace between China and the US and enable the whole world, India and the rest of Asia included, to benefit from continued peaceful coexistence? Or are we going to allow the fact of Brexit and the absence of a European foreign policy to mean that if India, China and the US can't sort this out, the Europe doesn't play any role and just lets it all fragment into some kind of ghastly conflagration? And that's the real challenge. And my biggest regret about Brexit is actually it's taken all our eyes off that kind of challenge and diverted them to what is in the end quite a minor issue for the world as a whole.
Well, thank you very much.
Just add one point among the three. The fourth is a maritime dimension. We would very much hope to see a Britain post-Brexit. It is still now playing a bigger role in the oceans of the world. Broadly, I'm not talking only of Navy.
And there are interesting developments even on the maritime security front in the UK and India happening. Sir, thank you for joining us here. It was a short but punchy discussion. So Letwin, particularly to you, thank you so much for joining us for a full day here at Brookings, India. We hope to have you back in a post-Brexit age and in a book age, and Sir Oliver Letwin author age, when your book is out too. Have a good trip to Bombay and back to London, where I'm sure there will be agitated days ahead of you. All the best, and please join me in a round of applause to both speakers. Thank you.